Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine finding out that the house you grew up in, the one filled with your happiest memories, was given away to someone else without your knowledge. And when you finally ask why, your own father tells you it's because you didn't deserve it. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. And what happened next was even more shocking. It started like any other call with my dad. We weren't the kind of family that had long, heartfelt conversations. Ours were usually quick updates about life, with the occasional joke thrown in. That day was no different. He asked me how work was going. I told him about a new project I was excited about, and then he mentioned he'd been thinking of making some changes. At first, I didn't think much of it. My dad wasn't one to elaborate unless pressed, and making changes could have meant anything from redoing the backyard to getting a new car. Oh yeah? What kind of changes? I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. That's when he said it, so casually it made my stomach drop. I've decided to sign over the house. I froze, gripping the phone tighter. What do you mean? Sign over the house? The house? The one I grew up in? Yeah, he replied, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. It's going to Mark. Mark, my stepmom's son, her golden boy. Mark had come into our lives when I was 16, after my mom passed away and my dad remarried. From the moment my dad said, "I do," to his second wife, everything changed. Suddenly, Mark was the center of attention. It didn't matter that he was only 2 years younger than me. He was treated like a prince, while I felt like I'd been relegated to the sidelines of my own family. Still, I never imagined things would come to this. The house wasn't just a building. It was our house, the one my parents bought when I was 5. Every memory I had of my mom was tied to that house. The way she'd hum off-key while cooking in the kitchen, the nights we spent reading together in the living room, the swing set in the backyard she insisted on putting together herself. And now my dad was giving it to Mark. Why Mark? I finally asked, my voice shaking with a mix of confusion and anger. What does he have to do with our house? He needs it, my dad said simply. I laughed bitterly, though nothing about this was funny. He needs it? What does that even mean? This house is our family's history, Dad. Mom's history. And you're just handing it over to him? There was a pause. And for a moment, I thought maybe he'd realize how ridiculous this was. But instead, he sighed, the way he always did when he thought I was being difficult. It's just a house, he said, and Mark will take care of it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Take care of it? What about me? Do I not matter in this equation? You don't need the house, he replied, his tone growing firm. You've got your own life, your own place. Mark's starting a family. He could use the space. I felt like I'd been slapped. The house I grew up in wasn't just being taken from me. It was being dismissed, like it didn't matter that it was my home, my memories, my connection to my mom. By the time the call ended, I was shaking with anger and disbelief. I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone, replaying the conversation in my head. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Mark didn't even need the house. He had a decent job and a small place of his own. And yet, my dad had decided he was more deserving of the home my mom and dad built together. The home that should have been part of my inheritance. That night, I barely slept. Memories of my childhood flashed through my mind, each one tied to that house. I thought of the creaky stairs that always gave me away when I tried to sneak downstairs for a midnight snack. The tiny handprints on the garage wall where my mom let me paint when I was 6. The oak tree in the front yard that I used to climb, its branches like a fortress. The idea of Mark living there, erasing those memories and making them his own, made my stomach turn. I knew I had to confront my dad. This wasn't something I could let go of, no matter how much he tried to downplay it. Little did I know, the answers I'd get would only make things worse. The drive to my dad's house felt agonizingly long, even though it was only 20 minutes away. My thoughts raced the entire time, jumping between disbelief and indignation. Why would he give the house to Mark? What did he mean when he said Mark needed it more? None of it made sense, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I got answers. When I pulled into the driveway, I was struck by a wave of nostalgia. The house looked the same as it always had, the white shutters, the neatly trimmed hedges, the swing hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. It still felt like home, but knowing my dad was ready to hand it over to Mark made it feel like a stranger's house. I found my dad on the porch, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper like he didn't have a care in the world. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a small smile, like this was just another Saturday. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's going on with the house, Dad? Why are you giving it to Mark?" He lowered his coffee cup and gave me a long, measured look, like he was deciding how much to tell me. Finally, he shrugged. It just makes sense. He needs it more than you do. Needs it? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. What does that even mean? This was our home, Dad. My home, and it's still part of the family, he said, as if that explained everything. Mark's got a family of his own to think about now. He needs the space. You're doing fine on your own. You've got your apartment, your career. What do you need with an old house? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do I need with it? I said, incredulous. Dad, this isn't just an old house. This is where I grew up. This is where Mom. I trailed off, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. My dad sighed and set his coffee down. I know it's hard, but it's just a house, kiddo. Memories don't live in walls. They live in here, he said, tapping his chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's not just a house, Dad, I shot back. It's part of our family's history. Mom's history. And you're just giving it away? To Mark, of all people? He frowned at my tone. Don't talk about Mark like that. He's family, too. Barely, I muttered, unable to hold back the bitterness in my voice. He waltzed into our lives when I was 16, and suddenly he's more important than me? That's not what this is about, my dad said, his voice hardening. This is about doing what's best for everyone. For everyone? Or just for Mark? The tension between us was palpable. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could see he was growing frustrated, but I didn't care. I needed answers. Why didn't you even talk to me about this? I asked, my voice quieter, but no less intense. You didn't think I deserved to know what you were planning? I didn't think it would matter, he admitted, which only made me feel worse. Of course it matters, I said, my voice cracking. This house meant everything to me. It still does. And you didn't even give me a chance to be part of the decision. My dad sighed again, leaning back in his chair. Look, I know you're upset, but this isn't about you. It's about what's practical. Mark's starting a family, and he needs the space. You've got your own life. You don't need this house anymore. That's not the point, Dad, I exclaimed. It's not about whether I need the house. It's about what it represents. You're choosing him over me. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. I'm not choosing anyone, he said finally. I'm doing what's best for the family. I stood there for a moment, staring at him, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. How could he not see how much this decision hurt me? How could he not understand what this house meant to me? I can't believe you're doing this, I said quietly. I can't believe you think this is okay. It's already done, he said, his tone final. That was the breaking point for me. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I felt tears prick my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't just about the house. It was about everything it symbolized. And for the first time, I realized that my relationship with my dad might never be the same again. I spent the rest of the day, after our confrontation, in a haze, replaying my dad's words over and over again. It was bad enough that he'd given the house to Mark without telling me. But what stung even more was the way he dismissed my feelings, as if my connection to the house didn't matter at all. I wasn't going to let it end there. The next day, I called him and told him I was coming over. I didn't wait for him to agree. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I got them. When I arrived, my dad was in his usual spot on the porch, nursing a coffee and reading the paper like nothing had happened. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. You're back, he said simply. Yeah, I'm back, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We're not done talking about this. He sighed, setting his coffee down on the side table. What else is there to talk about? There's a lot to talk about, I shot back. Like why you didn't even think I deserved to know about this. Or why you think Mark should have the house instead of me. At that, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. You didn't deserve it anyway, he said, his tone calm but firm. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. What? You heard me, he repeated, his voice steady. You've always had your head in the clouds, chasing after dreams that don't pay the bills. Mark's got a stable job, a family to support. He'll take care of the house the way it needs to be taken care of. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. That's what you think of me? I asked, my voice trembling. That I don't deserve it because I don't have a family? Because I don't live the way you think I should? It's not personal, he said, though his words felt like the most personal attack I'd ever heard. It's about practicality. Mark needs it more than you do. It's that simple. It's not that simple, Dad, I exclaimed. This house isn't just some property to me. It's my childhood. It's where Mom raised me. And now you're telling me that none of that matters because Mark has a stable job? Do you even hear yourself? He stared at me, his expression hardening. You're taking this way too personally, he said, his tone growing more clipped. It's just a house, kiddo. You've got your own life now. Let it go. Let it go. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Do you even care how much this hurts me? I asked, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. Do you care that you're choosing him over me? I'm not choosing anyone, he replied, though the decision he'd made said otherwise. This isn't about playing favorites. It's about doing what's right for the family. Right for who? I demanded, because it sure as hell isn't right for me. The more he talked, the clearer it became that there was no convincing him to see things from my perspective. He'd already made up his mind, and nothing I said was going to change it. But what hurt the most wasn't his decision. It was the way he justified it, as if my entire life had been one long series of failures in his eyes. You've always been the dreamer, he said, as if it were a bad thing. That's not a bad quality, but it's not practical. Mark's grounded. He knows how to manage a house, how to take care of a family. I'm not sure you do. His words cut deeper than I expected. I'd always known my dad didn't fully understand my choices, the career path I'd taken, the life I'd built for myself. But I never thought he'd see me as unworthy because of them. Thanks for the vote of confidence, I said bitterly, standing up. I guess I know where I stand now. Don't do this, he said, his voice softening slightly. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. You already did, Dad, I said, turning to leave. And I won't forget it. I drove home that night feeling more alone than I ever had before. For years, I tried to convince myself that my dad's approval didn't matter, that I was fine living my own life without needing his validation. But this situation proved otherwise. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything the house represented. It was about my mom, my childhood, and the bond one thought I had with my dad. And now, all of that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. As I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls, I realized something that filled me with both sadness and clarity. I'd spent my whole life trying to make my dad proud. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to be proud of myself. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start. It didn't take long for my dad's decision to become the talk of the family. In a world where every little bit of drama was dissected during holidays and family gatherings, news like this spread fast. By the end of the week, I'd already gotten multiple calls and texts from relatives asking, "What's going on with the house?" The first call came from my Aunt Linda, my mom's younger sister. She'd always been the one relative I felt truly close to, the one who made an effort to check in on me after my mom passed, even when the rest of the family moved on. When she called, I could hear the indignation in her voice before I even said hello. "I just heard what your dad did," she said without preamble. "That house should have gone to you. I don't know what he's thinking." I sighed, grateful for her support, but exhausted from having to explain the situation over and over again. "Thanks, Aunt Linda," I said. "But apparently, he thinks Mark needs it more." She let out a derisive laugh. "Mark? What does he need it for? He's not even part of this family." "Not really." Hearing someone else say what I'd been thinking made me feel slightly vindicated, but it didn't ease the sting. "Dad seems to think I don't deserve it," I said bitterly. "He actually said those words to me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't even know what to say to that," she finally said, her voice softer. "I know your dad's always been a little practical, but this is just cruel." Her support meant the world to me, but not everyone saw things the way she did. A few days later, I ran into my stepmom at the grocery store. The encounter was awkward from the start. She gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Hey there," like we were casual acquaintances instead of family. I didn't hold back. "Did you know about the house?" I asked, skipping the small talk. She didn't flinch, which told me everything I needed to know. "Of course I knew," she said, her tone defensive. "Your dad and I talked about it together." I felt my blood boil. "So, you're okay with this? With him giving away the house I grew up in?" She crossed her arms, her posture stiff. "Mark's the responsible one," she said flatly. "He's got a family to take care of. Meanwhile, you're always off doing your own thing. Your dad made the right call." Her words hit like a slap. "Doing my own thing?" I repeated. "You mean building a life for myself? Having a career? That's what you call irresponsible?" She shrugged, clearly uninterested in hearing my side. "It's not about you," she said. "It's about what's best for the family." The more people I talked to, the more I realized how divided everyone was. My cousins, who'd always stayed out of family drama, were suddenly full of opinions. Some were shocked that my dad had made such a drastic decision without telling me first. "I mean, it's your house," one cousin said during a group call. "Why would he just give it to Mark?" "Maybe he thought you wouldn't want it," another cousin chimed in. "Or maybe he thought Mark would take better care of it." Their words stung, even though I knew they weren't trying to hurt me. It seemed like everyone had their own theory about why my dad had done what he did, but no one had any real answers. Through it all, I felt like I was being pulled in a dozen different directions. Some family members sided with me, while others defended my dad's decision, saying it was practical or for the greater good. The worst part was knowing that the divide wasn't just between me and my dad. It was spreading throughout the family. Every time someone brought it up, it felt like another crack forming in the foundation of our relationships. As the weeks went on, I found myself withdrawing from the family more and more. I stopped answering calls, avoided gatherings, and tried to focus on my own life. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, the pain of what my dad had done and the way it had split our family was impossible to ignore. I wasn't just losing the house. I was losing the sense of belonging I'd always thought I had. And for the first time, I wondered if it was something I'd ever truly get back. After weeks of simmering frustration and unanswered questions, I decided to do something I probably should have done sooner. Dig into the details myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to my dad's decision than what he was letting on, and the only way to get the truth was to start asking the right questions. The first thing I did was look into the deed for the house. A family friend who worked in real estate had mentioned in passing that property transfers were public records, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to check. What I found stopped me cold. The deed to the house hadn't just been promised to Mark. It had already been transferred into his name months ago, long before my dad ever mentioned it to me. I stared at the document on my screen, the words blurring together as my mind raced. My dad hadn't just made this decision on a whim. He planned it. He'd gone through all the necessary steps, filed the paperwork, and handed over the house without saying a word to me. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even given me a chance to have a say in the matter. It was done, finalized, and the house I'd grown up in no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to Mark. The second bombshell hit me when I confronted my dad about it. "Why didn't you tell me you already gave him the house?" I demanded, holding up a copy of the deed I'd printed out. He didn't even look surprised. "Because I knew how you'd react," he said simply. "You'd blow it out of proportion, just like you're doing now." Blow it out of proportion? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "You didn't think I deserved to know?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "It wasn't your business," he said, shrugging like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Furious, I decided to take my question straight to Mark. If he'd known about this all along, I wanted to hear it from him directly. I texted him, telling him we needed to talk, and to my surprise, he agreed to meet. We sat down at a coffee shop a few days later, and from the moment I saw him, I could tell he wasn't nervous. If anything, he looked smug, like he'd already won whatever game we were playing. "Why didn't you tell me about the house?" I asked bluntly, skipping the small talk. Mark leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee before answering. "Your dad made the decision," he said with a shrug. "It wasn't my place to say anything." "That's not the point," I shot back. "You knew how much that house meant to me. You knew what it represented. And you didn't think I deserved to know what was going on?" He shrugged again, his nonchalance infuriating me even more. "Look, your dad did what he thought was best. I didn't force him to give me the house. Maybe you should ask yourself why he trusts me more than he trusts you." His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. As much as I hated to give them any weight, they echoed the doubts I'd been wrestling with ever since my dad made his decision. Why didn't my dad trust me? Why didn't he think I was capable of taking care of the house? "Trust has nothing to do with it," I said through gritted teeth. "This isn't about who deserves the house. It's about honesty and respect. Two things neither of you seem to understand." Mark smirked, clearly unfazed by my anger. "Believe what you want," he said, standing up and grabbing his coffee. "But at the end of the day, it's just a house. Maybe it's time you moved on." I watched him walk away, my hands shaking with anger. To him, it might have been just a house, but to me, it was everything. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the copy of the deed I'd printed out. The words transferred to Mark Harris felt like a slap in the face every time I read them. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the choices my dad had made, the secrets he'd kept, and the blatant favoritism he'd shown. And as much as I wanted to believe it didn't matter, Mark's comment about trust kept ringing in my ears. Why didn't my dad trust me? The more I thought about it, the more determined I became to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The tension between my dad and me hadn't eased since I found out about the house, and my relationship with the rest of the family wasn't faring much better. The more I tried to piece things together, the more fragmented everything felt. It was like every conversation with my dad or stepmom revealed another layer of betrayal. Then came the conversation that turned everything upside down. A family friend, Sarah, called me out of the blue one afternoon. Sarah had known my parents for years, and while we weren't particularly close, she'd always been kind to me. Her tone was hesitant, almost apologetic as she said, "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I think you need to know. I heard your dad updated his will recently, and, well, you might want to look into it. Things aren't what you think they are." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated before replying. "I don't want to get in the middle of family stuff, but from what I've heard, Mark and your stepmom stand to get pretty much everything." My stomach dropped. It wasn't about the money. I couldn't have cared less about the financial aspect. It was about what it symbolized. The house had been bad enough, but this, if my dad had rewritten his will to leave everything to Mark and my stepmom, it meant I'd been completely cut out. I thanked Sarah for telling me and hung up, my mind racing. Could this really be true? Was I no longer a part of my dad's plans for the future? That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea that my dad might have erased me from his will felt like a betrayal on a deeper level than anything that had come before. It wasn't about material things. It was about my place in his life, in our family's legacy. The next day, I made a few phone calls and confirmed what Sarah had told me. My dad had updated his will about 6 months earlier, shortly after finalizing the transfer of the house. And just as Sarah had said, almost everything, his savings, his investments, even his personal belongings, was now set to go to my stepmom and Mark. My name wasn't mentioned once. Seeing the cold, hard evidence in writing was like a punch to the gut. My dad had made a deliberate choice to exclude me, to cut me out of his life in every meaningful way. I didn't know what to do with the information. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers and make him explain how he could justify erasing me from his plans. But another part of me was too hurt, too raw, to face him. For days, I kept the knowledge to myself, unsure of how to proceed. When I finally did bring it up to my dad, it wasn't with anger. It was with a quiet sadness that I couldn't shake. "Why?" I asked him during yet another tense visit to his house. "Why am I not in the will?" He looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, his expression a mix of annoyance and discomfort. "Who told you about that?" he asked, his tone defensive. "Does it matter?" I replied. I know you changed it. I know you left everything to Mark and her." My dad sighed, setting the paper down. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, a phrase that had become his go-to lately. "It's not like I'm planning to die anytime soon." "That's not the point, Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "You didn't even include me. Not a single thing. What does that say about how you see me? About our relationship?" He rubbed his temples, as if the conversation was physically draining him. "Look, you've made it clear that you don't need me," he said. "You've got your own life, your own career. You don't rely on me for anything. Mark and his family, they're the ones who need the help." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So because I don't need you, I don't matter to you?" "That's not what I said," he replied, though the implication was clear. The conversation ended with me storming out, feeling more lost than ever. No matter how much I tried to understand my dad's reasoning, it always came back to the same painful realization. He didn't see me as part of his family anymore. For weeks, I wrestled with the anger and sadness that the discovery had stirred in me. Every time I thought about the will, about the house, about the way my dad had dismissed me over and over again, it felt like another piece of our relationship breaking away. It wasn't about money. It was about legacy, about respect, about being seen and valued. And in my dad's eyes, it seemed like I was none of those things. The question that haunted me most wasn't why he'd done it. It was whether I could ever forgive him for it. The more I thought about my dad's decision and the changes he'd made to his will, the more questions I had. Nothing about the situation made sense. My dad had always been a straightforward, no-nonsense kind of person. Giving away the house and cutting me out of the will seemed so out of character. Or at least, out of the character I thought I knew. I couldn't let it go. There had to be more to the story, something I wasn't seeing. So I started digging. At first, I didn't know where to begin. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew there had to be an explanation for why my dad had made Mark the center of his plans. I started with old family records, bank statements, property documents, anything I could find. My dad wasn't the type to throw things away, and I knew he kept boxes of paperwork in the attic. One evening, while my dad was out, I went over to the house under the guise of picking up some old photo albums. My stepmom let me in without a second thought, and as soon as I had access to the attic, I began my search. At first, it was just mundane stuff. Old tax returns, utility bills from years ago, receipts for home repairs. But then I stumbled across a file labeled Mark, Expenses. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside were copies of checks, bank transfer records, and handwritten notes detailing a series of payments my dad had been making to Mark over the years. Some were labeled as loans, while others had vague descriptions like household support or business expenses. The amounts varied, but they weren't small. One payment alone was for $5,000. I sat back, trying to process what I was seeing. It was clear that Mark had been struggling financially for years, something my dad had never mentioned to me. I flipped through the file, each new document painting a clearer picture of the situation. There was one note, dated 2 years ago, that caught my attention. In it, my dad had written, "Mark asked for help again today. Not sure how much longer I can keep bailing him out." Bailing him out? The word stuck in my mind like a thorn. The house wasn't just a gift, as my dad had claimed. It was a bailout, a way to provide Mark with financial security at my expense. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, and an odd sense of pity. Mark had clearly been struggling, but instead of being upfront about it, my dad had hidden the truth from me. He'd chosen to quietly funnel money to Mark while leaving me in the dark. I didn't confront my dad right away. Instead, I went home and spent hours combing through the documents, trying to piece together the full story. I wanted to understand the extent of my dad's support for Mark and why he'd gone to such lengths to keep it a secret. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the lies and the lack of trust. My dad had made decisions that affected our entire family, but he'd done so without including me, without even considering how it might feel for me to find out like this. When I finally did decide to confront him, I didn't hold back. I went over to the house with the file in hand, my heart pounding as I walked through the door. My dad was in the living room, watching TV, and when he saw the look on my face, he muted the volume. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone wary. I dropped the file on the coffee table. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. He glanced at the file, his expression hardening. "Where did you get that?" "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been making payments to Mark for years, payments you never told me about. And now you're giving him the house because he needs it? This wasn't a gift, was it? It was a bailout." My dad sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then explain it to me." I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been bending over backward to support Mark while treating me like an afterthought." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Mark's had a rough time," he said finally. "He's made some mistakes, and I've been trying to help him get back on his feet. And you couldn't have told me that?" I asked, my voice rising. "You couldn't have trusted me with the truth instead of shutting me out?" My dad shook his head. "It wasn't about shutting you out. It was about protecting Mark's privacy. He didn't want anyone to know." "Protecting his privacy?" I repeated, incredulous. "At the cost of your relationship with me? Do you even realize what you've done, Dad? You didn't just give him money. You gave him everything. The house, the will, all of it. And you didn't even think I deserved to know why." He looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Well, you weren't," I replied, my voice breaking. "You were just picking favorites. And now I know where I stand." I left the house that night feeling more betrayed than ever. The revelation about the payments had answered some questions, but it had also raised new ones. Why had my dad gone to such lengths for Mark? And why had he been so willing to sacrifice our relationship in the process? I didn't know if I'd ever get the answers I needed. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about a pattern of choices my dad had made. Choices that had pushed me further and further away. And for the first time, I wondered if our relationship was even salvageable. After uncovering the truth about the payments my dad had been making to Mark, I couldn't hold back any longer. I needed to confront him again, this time with all the evidence laid out. I thought I was prepared for the conversation, but as I drove to his house, my heart raced with a mixture of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about the money or the house anymore. It was about the years of deception and the growing realization that my dad didn't see me the way I thought he did. When I arrived, I found him in the kitchen, sipping his ever-present coffee and reading something on his phone. He looked up as I walked in, and his expression immediately shifted to wary. "You look upset," he said, setting his cup down. "I didn't waste time. Why didn't you tell me the truth?" I demanded, placing the file of documents on the table in front of him. "Why lie about all of this?" He glanced at the file, then back at me, and sighed heavily. "I didn't lie," he said after a moment. "I just didn't tell you everything." I stared at him, incredulous. "That's the same thing as lying, Dad. You hid the fact that you've been bailing Mark out for years. You hid the fact that the house wasn't a gift. It was a way to cover for his mistakes. And you didn't think I deserved to know. He rubbed his temples, clearly annoyed. I thought it would be easier this way, he said, his tone defensive. Easier for who? I shot back, my voice rising. Because it sure wasn't easier for me. Do you have any idea how it feels to find out you've been lying to me? That you've been favoring him all this time while I was completely in the dark? It's not about favoritism, he said, though the words rang hollow. Mark needed help. You didn't. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That's your justification? That I didn't need help, so you decided to throw me aside? Do you even hear yourself? He stood up from the table, his frustration evident. You've always been independent, he said. You've never needed me the way Mark does. I thought you'd understand. Understand? I repeated, shaking my head. You thought I'd understand being shut out of my own family? You thought I'd understand you giving away everything that mattered to me without so much as a conversation? His expression softened slightly, but the damage was already done. It wasn't meant to hurt you, he said quietly. I was just trying to do what I thought was best. Well, you failed, I said, my voice breaking. You didn't just hurt me, Dad. You destroyed my trust in you. And I don't know if that's something we can fix. The conversation felt like a blur after that. I don't remember everything we said, but I know it ended with me walking out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process everything that had just happened. This wasn't the first time my dad had let me down, but it felt like the most final. He'd made it clear where I stood in his life, or rather, where I didn't stand. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't keep fighting for a relationship that felt so one-sided. In the days that followed, I made the difficult decision to cut ties with him. It wasn't something I did lightly, and it wasn't something I wanted, but every time I thought about our conversation, about the way he dismissed my feelings and justified his actions, I realized that staying in his life would only bring more pain. I stopped answering his calls, stopped responding to his texts. When my stepmom reached out, I ignored her too. It wasn't out of spite. It was out of self-preservation. I needed space to heal, to figure out who I was without the weight of his betrayal hanging over me. That decision wasn't easy, and it didn't come without consequences. My stepmom called me selfish. My dad left me voicemail after voicemail, accusing me of overreacting. Even some of my cousins tried to mediate, saying, "He's your dad. You can't just walk away." But I could, and I did. That conversation was the last straw for me. It marked the end of a chapter in my life, a chapter filled with hurt and disappointment, but also lessons I couldn't ignore. I'd spent years trying to win my dad's approval, trying to be the kind of person he could be proud of. But in the end, I realized that his opinion of me didn't define my worth. Walking away wasn't just about cutting ties with my dad. It was about reclaiming my own sense of self. It was about choosing to prioritize my happiness and peace over a relationship that had caused me more pain than joy. And while the decision broke my heart, it also set me free. In the months that followed my decision to distance myself from my dad, the initial sting of our confrontation gave way to a quiet sadness. It wasn't the sharp, fiery kind of anger I'd felt before. This was something softer, deeper, a dull ache that came with the realization that the relationship I'd spent my entire life building might never be the same again. I didn't stop caring about my dad, and I didn't stop missing him, but I knew that staying close to him, pretending like everything was fine, would only bring more pain. It wasn't about holding a grudge or seeking revenge. It was about survival. My peace had been eroded by years of feeling overlooked, undervalued, and excluded. So, I let go. Slowly, painfully, but deliberately, I let go. At first, it was harder than I expected. Cutting ties didn't just mean avoiding my dad's calls or skipping family gatherings. It meant rebuilding my life from the ground up, creating a sense of belonging and security that didn't depend on him or the house I'd once called home. I threw myself into work, taking on projects that challenged me and gave me a sense of accomplishment. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college, and found solace in the quiet rhythm of brushstrokes on canvas. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream about what my future could look like. What I wanted, not what anyone else expected of me. One of the first big steps I took was finding a new place to live. My apartment had always felt temporary, like a placeholder while I figured out my next move. But now, I wanted something that was truly mine, a space where I could put down roots and build a life that felt stable and secure. The process of searching for a new home was both daunting and empowering. I toured countless places, looking for one that felt right. It wasn't just about finding four walls and a roof. It was about finding a place where I could create new memories, new traditions, and a new sense of self. When I finally found it, I knew instantly. It was a small, cozy house on a quiet street with a little garden in the back and just enough space for me to grow into. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen needed updating, and the floors creaked when you walked across them, but it felt right. It felt like the kind of place where I could heal and rebuild. Moving in was a process, both physically and emotionally. As I unpacked boxes and hung pictures on the walls, I couldn't help but think about the house I'd left behind, the one that had been taken from me without my consent. But instead of feeling bitter, I tried to focus on what I was gaining: independence, clarity, and the chance to start fresh. Letting go of my dad wasn't just about physical distance. It was about letting go of the expectations I'd placed on our relationship. I'd spent so much of my life seeking his approval, trying to live up to an ideal that I wasn't sure I even believed in. Without that weight, I felt lighter, freer. I stopped measuring my worth by his standards and started embracing who I was, flaws and all. There were still moments of doubt, of course. There were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I'd been too harsh or too stubborn. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of why I'd made the decision in the first place. It wasn't about punishing my dad or proving a point. It was about protecting myself. As the months passed, I found myself growing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became more confident, more self-assured. I stopped second-guessing myself and started trusting my instincts. I also began to open up to others in ways I hadn't before. Without the constant tension of my relationship with my dad hanging over me, I had more energy to invest in friendships and connections. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and even started dating again, a leap I hadn't been ready to take in years. Through it all, I learned to find joy in the little things. The smell of coffee in the morning, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the windows, the sound of rain tapping against the roof. These small moments became the foundation of a life that felt full and meaningful, even without the family dynamic I'd once relied on. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living life on my own terms, not defined by my dad's expectations or the pain of the past, but by the person I was becoming. And while the scars of what had happened would always be there, they no longer defined me. Instead, they became a reminder of how far I'd come and how much strength I'd found in choosing to walk away. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the memories or pretending like the hurt never happened. It meant accepting what was and finding the courage to move forward anyway. And as I stood in the garden of my new home, watching the first flowers bloom in the spring sunshine, I realized that I'd finally found peace. Not in a house or a family or a legacy, but in myself. Looking back on everything that happened, the house, the will, the arguments, the distance, I've come to understand that losing my childhood home wasn't just about losing a physical space. It was about losing the illusion of who I thought my dad was, and in some ways who I thought I was too. For years, I carried this image of my dad as someone who would always have my back, who valued the same things I did, and who saw me for who I truly was. But when that illusion shattered, it forced me to confront some painful truths. That my dad wasn't the person I thought he was, and that I wasn't the person he wanted me to be. At first, that realization felt like a loss, like a part of my identity had been ripped away. But over time, I came to see it differently. Losing that illusion didn't weaken me. It made me stronger. It forced me to let go of the need for his approval and to find validation within myself. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the people closest to us. The people we trust the most are also the ones with the power to hurt us the most. And when that trust is broken, it leaves scars that don't fade easily. But those scars also tell a story of resilience. They're a reminder of what I've been through, of the strength it took to walk away and start over. And they've taught me that while family is important, it doesn't have to define you. For so long, I clung to the idea that my dad's opinion of me was the ultimate measure of my worth. But losing that connection showed me something I hadn't realized before, that I was capable of building a life that was entirely my own. The house may be gone, but what I've built since then is something even better. I've created a life on my own terms, a life filled with people who value and support me, with passions and pursuits that bring me joy, and with a sense of self-worth that doesn't rely on anyone else. My new home has become a symbol of that journey. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not as grand or nostalgic as the house I grew up in, but it's mine, and every corner of it reflects the person I've become. I've filled it with memories of my own making. Dinners with friends, quiet mornings with coffee and a book, late-night painting sessions where I lose track of time. These moments, small and simple as they are, have brought me more happiness than I ever thought possible. Moving forward hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. I've learned to let go of the pain and bitterness, to accept what happened without letting it define me. And while my relationship with my dad remains distant, I've found peace in knowing that I did everything I could to make things right. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe one day, we'll find a way to bridge the gap, to rebuild what was lost. Or maybe we won't. Either way, I made my peace with it. Life doesn't always turn out the way you expect it to, but sometimes the detours lead you to places you never imagined. Losing the house, the relationship, and the illusion of what I thought my family was supposed to be felt devastating at the time. But it also set me free. Looking back, I've realized that the most important thing I've gained isn't a house, or a relationship, or even closure. It's a deeper understanding of myself, of my strength, my resilience, and my ability to create a life that's truly my own. The house may be gone, but it was never really about the house. It was about the memories, the lessons, and the person I've become because of them. And as I stand in the garden of my new home, watching the sun set and feeling the warmth of the life I've built around me, I know one thing for certain. I've moved forward, and I'm happier now than I ever thought I could be.